Welcome to the Napa Legal Podcast. I'm Frank DeVito, Senior Counsel and Director of Content at Napa Legal.
And I'm Joseph Clement, Content and Program Manager at Napa Legal.
You're listening to the Napa Legal Weekly Podcast, where we explore religious liberty from the perspective of faith-based nonprofits. So for those of you who are listening, I think at least some of our listeners were at the Napa Institute Conference this past week in California, as was I. It's highly recommended for any of our Catholic listeners, which is probably most of our listeners, but an amazing event of wonderful speakers and content and community. And really, I've been saying all week, the best Catholic environment on earth. So I'm still admittedly rather jet lagged, but wanted to continue my streak of never missing these podcasts. So here we are. So this week we'll be covering a ruling against the Washington state law that we've previously covered that attempted to force members of the clergy to violate the seal of the confessional. Then we'll cover a new pro-life program in Mississippi. Then we'll finish up by talking about a promising trend that we've been observing of hospitals pulling back from performing transgender procedures on minors. So with that, let's get into it. The first one that we're going to talk about is the Washington state law. We've covered this when it first came out. You'll probably remember the mandated reporter laws in the state of Washington were recently amended, removing the exemption to the mandated reporter laws. This is for child abuse. They removed clergy from the mandated reporter exemption, even when the clergy obtain information within privileged communication. This obviously has problematic consequences for the seal of the confessional, which canon law is very clear cannot be violated by clergy when they learn of information within the sacrament of confession. So the law also contained an explicit exception from the exception for clergymen, which was what made it so problematic. And as we had predicted on this podcast, an easy case for a court to rule the law unconstitutional. So now, in a long expected outcome, the district court in Washington state ruled that Washington's law likely does violate the First Amendment. And so the court issued a preliminary injunction against enforcement of the law. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that the order was written by a Biden-appointed judge. So this was such an obvious violation. This is not a controversial political thing where we would expect judges appointed by presidents of certain political persuasions would vote one way and others another. This was such a straight violation in our view and in the judge's view of the First Amendment. So first of all, I want to point out that what matters here is the Employment Division versus Smith case, the current precedent on how the First Amendment is interpreted, right? The Smith case, unfortunately, we think, says that if a law that is passed is neutral and generally applicable, right? It applies to everyone, it's neutral toward religion, then strict scrutiny or the highest standard of scrutiny and suspicion by the court does not apply. We think that's problematic in a lot of cases, but I don't think it really comes into play here because in a plain reading of the Washington law, it's clearly not neutral and generally applicable. And so it was amazing for me to read in the motion for the preliminary injunction and in the court's order that Washington state indeed defended its law as neutral and generally applicable. And the court had a lot to say about this, and they were not subtle. Or it was not subtle. So the court says, I'm going to read here from the correct understanding of what neutral and generally applicable means. So the court says that its job here is to determine whether the law treats any comparable secular activity more favorably than religious activity. That's from the case Tandon v. Newsom. So the court has to first determine what constitutes comparable secular activity, right? And the court goes on to say, to find the proper comparator, courts analyze the government interest that justifies the regulation at issue. So a law lacks general applicability if it prohibits religious conduct while permitting secular conduct that undermines the government's asserted interests in a similar way. Okay, let's break that down. So first of all, this is just clearly not neutral because the law was amended to say, except for members of the clergy, there's a privileged communications exemption, right? So if there's a privileged communication between doctor and patient, nurse and patient, therapist and the person the therapist is treating, there's an exemption from the privileged communications exemption to the mandated reporter law, but clergy are exempted. So it's clearly not neutral nor generally applicable because it doesn't apply to secular actors like doctors, nurses, therapists, right? So right here we failed. But even if we were applying strict scrutiny, So you would, if you were, you would need a compelling interest, right? What is the government's compelling interest that overrides, as it were, the religious liberty interest here, right? So the court acknowledges, yeah, there's a compelling interest in preventing child abuse, right? But the state, and this is the court talking, quote, has a failure to demonstrate why it has an interest of the highest order in denying an exemption to clergy while making such exemptions available to other professionals. And the court says this is likely fatal to the law. And that's right. That's what at the heart of this is, okay, if the state is saying we have such a compelling interest in preventing child abuse that everyone who receives sensitive information about child abuse or children, is forced to report, then we'd at least have a different issue, because then on its face, it would be neutral and generally applicable, right? We'd still have a seal of confessional problem, but at least then there would be an argument that this is neutral and applies to everyone. But if the government is saying that doctors, nurses, therapists get the exemption, but priests do not, they have to show, okay, why do you have a compelling interest in giving this exemption to everybody except the clergy? There clearly is no compelling interest to that. There's no rational explanation that I can see other than you're singling out clergy for some kind of ideological or anti-religious purposes. I don't know why else you would do this, right? It's very unclear why the state would maybe argue that, I don't know, people going to confession are just reporting child abuse all the time that clerics could help prevent, but it doesn't happen with nurses or doctors or therapists. I mean, that's just not likely. There's really nothing here. So again, this is a preliminary injunction. It means that the law is likely going to be ruled unconstitutional on its merits as this case proceeds. And it was great to see the immediate response from the church and from others outside of the church to make sure that Washington didn't get away with what we think was clearly a kind of anti-religious virtue signaling, because there was no way this was ever going to stand under the First Amendment. So, Joseph, do you have any thoughts on this case?
Yeah, two things I'd like to add. First, I was very glad to see how the local parishes and bishops responded when the Washington law was first passed and before this ruling came out. They immediately emphasized the importance of the seal of confession, and assured congregants that it would be maintained. We talked a little bit about how this law could dissuade people of faith from coming to the sacrament within the Catholic Church, and the local parishes and bishops immediately tried to mitigate that and make that not a concern that would kind of carry people away from the sacrament. The Bishop of Spokane, Thomas Daly, said that shepherds, bishops, and priests are committed to keeping the seal of confession, even to the point of going to jail. Bishop Barron, who's a bit more well-known, when he was discussing the Catholic understanding of confession, so that absolutely nothing ought to stand in the way of a sinner who seeks this font of grace. So if most of our listeners are Catholic, those who don't understand, the sacrament of confession is hugely important within the faith. It has eternal ramifications. So getting to see the leaders within the church immediately saying, this is what we're going to stick with. We're going to abide by our faith. We'll take the steps necessary to combat this. But for right now, it's like, we're going to do what we know we're supposed to within our faith. That was a great response. And secondly, about the broader coverage going on around this, not unsurprisingly, most of the headlines aren't actually giving the whole picture of what's going on. A few examples from pretty large news outlets. One says, federal court blocks new Washington law requiring priests to report abuse and neglect. Another, Trump and the Catholic Church fight a law requiring clergy to report child abuse. One last one, Washington state law requiring clergy to report child abuse on hold. So most of the coverage that we're seeing from these large outlets are saying this Washington law that makes priests report child abuse is being overturned. It's very misleading. Clergy are still mandated reporters. They were before this law. They are going to be afterwards. It's that just during privileged communication, such as during confession, they have the same exemption as other professionals. Doctors already have this exemption. Nurses, other fields. So this kind of coverage that says priests and people in the Catholic Church are fighting this law that requires reporting child abuse. That's not what's happening. This is a very particular instance. So I think it's really important to clarify a little bit of the nuance of what's going on here.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just a couple things to cover to wrap this up on both of your points. So on the first one about the encouraging and bold immediate response from the Catholic Church, it's worth pointing out that so the canon law, and for the non-Catholic listeners or those who don't follow this kind of stuff, canon law, the church's law, is what governs the conduct of bishops and priests. And canon law is uncompromising. If a communication occurs within the sacrament of confession, right? Somebody goes in and is actually making a confession, priests have no ability to disclose that in any circumstance. That includes if the penitent waives it, right? If the penitent finishes the confession and says, Father, I feel guilty about what I've done, like you go and report this, he still can't do it. It's up to the penitent to go and report it. So there's no discretion here. It's very clear. And the other thing, talking about how this was covered and handled, I want to shout out, I know we did last time we talked about this, but the Harmeet Dillon, who's in the Attorney General's office in charge of civil rights, she came out on this and clearly was being advised by people who understand the Catholic Church and canon law because she's not a Christian. But her response was very good, and she understood that the canon law issues are very very clear here, and that there was no way that this was going to fly. And so with those two things in mind, I think it's worth pointing out that, to my point earlier about this being a kind of virtue signal, it clearly is that, because the chances that this was going to disclose to actually stop or disclose any child abuse was slim to none, because priests are willing to keep the seal of confessional. Like, changing this law was not going to make priests start reporting things that they heard within the confessional to the government. So this would not have been effective. And we're glad to see that it's blocked, and it looks like this will be the end of this law. I mean, the enforcement is not there, but I think this will die pretty quickly. So with that, let's move to trouble in Washington to hope in Mississippi.
Yeah,
Joseph.
lots of good updates today. This is one that I was really excited to get to cover. I think since the podcast has come out, I've been kind of the most interested in this particular one, because it's very encouraging and a very beautiful thing to get to read about. So not a legal update, but this is about the expansion and beginning of a state program that actually works to save lives. And just to preface it, we've talked a little bit on this podcast and in different kind of circumstances about the importance of the relationship between the state government, particularly the Attorney General's office, and pregnancy resource centers. There are lots of cases in New York and California about some troubling lawsuits being brought by the AG against these resource centers. So in Mississippi, there's a tremendous relationship, it seems. MAMA, the aptly named program, is MAMA, the Mississippi Access to Maternal Assistance Program, partners the state's Attorney General office with public, private, and faith-based organizations to expand access to life-saving care relationships and resources. So getting into some of the details of the program, it was founded 2 years ago by state law. It's seen a lot of expansion and has really kind of taken root since then. It basically provides information on a network of nonprofits and other resource centers with a public website when it's free to use and everything. So the website provides a map of nonprofits and other organizations that offer a pretty wide variety of services, all kind of a pro-family, very much pro-life in the fullest sense of the word, from before conception all the way through parenthood. It includes stuff like some pregnancy counseling and ultrasounds. There's food pantries, support for adoption, childcare, even adult education and job openings. There's help combating addiction. There's more resources like strollers, cribs. So it's a pretty comprehensive map of these centers in different areas across the state that provide a lot of different really important resources that otherwise could totally be lacking. A quick search in any of the categories produces dozens of different centers, and it's all mapped out. So if somebody lives in a particular area, they can say, oh, I live here, show me what I can just drive to find food for my baby. The site doesn't refer to organizations that offer abortions. Just to test it out, there's a search function. I typed in abortion and it corrected to adoption and showed a center nearby. And it's already having a huge impact. As I said, it started in state law 2 years ago. It takes some time to actually begin, but since it's actually started, it's served over 23,000 women and counting, increasing every day. So it's really a beautiful thing. Like I said, it's pro-life in the fullest sense of the word. From here are resources during your pregnancy, here are resources after. There's even counseling for women that have had abortions, and it just provides this information in a really beautiful way, and it's very encouraging too. The website opens up and you scroll down and it says, "Mama, you can do this," next to a picture of a mom with her baby. It says, "We are here for you and your family." There's, like I said, jobs, childcare, counseling, cribs. It's just very positive. It's a very good understanding of what it means to be a parent, and it's just so encouraging. Um, it really works to build a culture of life, and this part is so important to society today. It works to change this conversation about an unexpected pregnancy from something that's stressful and negative to this beautiful thing, and is just trying to help people as much as it can. So there's nothing hostile, angry, or partisan. it's just a very warm and important resource. I think every state can and should have something like this. So super happy to see this. It's an incredible thing. I'm just so happy to to shine a light on it. So Frank, if you have more to add.
Yeah, no, making sure that we shine a light on it and capture the truth of the messaging on this is really important. I had a good conversation at the Napa Institute. And again, I met a lot of people in this space at Napa last week, so I just wanted to highlight a couple of them where so I had a conversation with Monse Alvarado, who's the president of EWTN, the television network, and she was saying on a panel last week that, we have to recapture the messaging here because there's this kind of idea being promulgated that, oh, pro-lifers just care about stopping abortions. They don't actually care about poor moms and babies and their horrible circumstances. And Monsi was saying, this is frankly a lie. Like the pro-life movement is not like this. And I could see it throughout the week. If anybody's ever met the Sisters of Life, the religious order of sisters, who's particularly committed to, the pro-life movement, that means in the fullest sense. I mean, they walk with moms. I was talking to the mother general of the order, who's an old friend, and we were chatting about legal stuff and about some things we could do together. And she's like, "Oh, that couple, they have a baby. Like, excuse me, I want to go hold that baby." And so right, they're constantly taking care of moms, taking care of babies. My wife is actually a coworker with the Sisters of Life, and she's volunteered to take moms in troubled pregnancies to doctor's appointments and to befriend them and to take them out to coffee. Like this is what the pro-life movement is doing. I also met a group that was starting a home for single moms with troubled, difficult pregnancies, and they were particularly working to get the funding to expand their housing so that they could house mothers in spaces big enough where if they already have children, those children can be there too, so they can take more than just first-time pregnant moms. So this is happening all across the pro-life movement, and any idea that we just care about stopping abortions and not supporting moms and babies, it's just not true. And so, yeah, hats off to Mississippi and to the many wonderful religious and apostolates who are doing the work to really support life in the fullest sense. All right, so last issue before we wrap up today, there's a recent report going on that there are major hospitals around the country that are stopping the performance of transgender chemical and surgical procedures on minors. So we've covered the Skirmetti case recently on this podcast, which, if you remember, came out just over a month ago, ruling that states can indeed ban these transgender procedures for minors, and that's not a violation of the Constitution. But since then, there's been a lot of coverage of this, and that's not the only way that there has been a fight against these procedures over the last few months. As many on this listening to the podcast probably know, the Trump administration has taken several steps to prevent these procedures from mutilating young people who struggle with gender identity issues, including an early executive order that worked to defund federal dollars going to hospitals that were performing these harmful procedures. So there have been several hospitals that have recently announced that they're no longer doing these things. One is called Kaiser Permanente, the Children's National Hospital, several university medical centers. This is a big deal, right? The people who have these kind of gender dysphoria issues, especially as children, who have lost a sense of their identity, right, who they are, they need help, right? And there's a great quote from Joseph, you found this, from a Catholic bioethicist, Father Tad Pacholczyk, I think it is, who said, hospitals, when they stop these procedures, now have a greater opportunity to, quote, address the real needs of these individuals with compassion rather than violate their dignity by harming the people that these hospitals and doctors exist to serve. So it's great to see that this is actually a trend that's starting to happen. And I just want to point out that, legislation matters. Like legislation that bans these things obviously matters. Legislation is meant to promote the common good. These kind of procedures that have irreversible effects on minors are bad, and so they should be banned, frankly. But beyond just banning them, there are a couple things that have to be done to turn the tide on these kind of issues, and they are being done, especially in the last year, I would say. One, you need spotlight, right? What's the quote? Daylight is often the best disinfectant, right? That just shining a light on what's going on can go really far. So I think in the last year, this has been a huge issue. It's been in the media. It's making people actually take a look at what these procedures are, the effects that they're having on young people. And I think that's really turned the tide on public opinion. And the other thing is money. Money turns the tide, right? So if hospitals are going to be receiving government grants and making tons of money from insurance payments to do these kind of procedures, then they're much more incentivized to do them, right? But if their federal funding is being cut if they do these procedures, if they're going to start to be subject to lawsuits for medical malpractice and other things for the harm they cause by these procedures, it's going to make these procedures less and less likely, right? So as we're seeing a lot of change on this issue, people in the mainstream in this country are starting to realize that this isn't, proven by science the way we've been told. The side effects, the long-term results are starting to come in now that this stuff has been going on for years, and the results are quite bad. And the whole transgender procedures for minors issue, it's politically unpopular and it's increasingly bad for business. So this kind of constant march of let's shine the light on what's really happening, what the effects really are, let's stop the spigots of funding. It's really starting to turn the tide. So the funding cuts combined with possible lawsuits and legislation in the coming years, we're hopeful will continue to roll back these procedures and hopefully bring the end of these harmful practices as a mainstream endeavor.
Yeah, like you said, a lot of things need to happen and are happening to expose how brutal these things are and how bad for kids and families these chemical and surgical interventions with the natural characteristics of their sex are. It's a huge cultural issue. It's a practical issue too. There have been over 14,000 instances of doctors performing these quote unquote gender transitions on minors. I think over 5,000 of them were actual surgical um, interventions, and that's only instances that are covered by insurance. So the actual estimations are, I mean, tens of thousands of kids in the last 4 years have been a victim to these horrible procedures. Um, and like you said, there's a lot that has to happen in the cultural battle too. Um, Thankfully, that's starting to get a lot more headway. In Skirmetti, like you mentioned, the first couple pages of that opinion were Chief Justice Roberts writing, "Hey, here are all the studies that show there actually is a question of medical validity as to whether or not these are good, and to the long term impacts of these things." So, getting to see more and more, there's this, if not consensus about the bad, there's a lack of consensus that these are good. And more we're seeing more evidence about the dangers of these procedures and that being carried out into actual practical results.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to round this out, I would say, as we always want to point out, that these are not religious liberty cases in the sense that this is not a RFRA claim or a First Amendment religious liberty issue per se, but this has direct implications for religious people and religious organizations, right? Especially because we have a lot of nonprofit religious hospitals that are often pressured to do immoral things. So this gets to the core of especially Catholic teaching, but of religious teaching in general, right? Religion has a lot to say about what is true and what is good. And the reality is people are born as a boy or a girl, as a man or a woman, and to deny that that's a reality, and then further to try to mutilate bodies and hormones to deny that reality is very harmful to the common good and to the lives of people. So this it's not a religious liberty issue per se, but it is very much a religious issue that we care deeply about because we want all people and all organizations to be able to flourish. And when the law allows, and especially when it favors or compels behavior that is so contrary to religious truth about the human person and human sexuality, that's something we have to speak up on. So with that, we thank you for joining us for another episode of the Napa Legal Podcast. As always, we ask that if you enjoy the content we're putting out, if you would like this podcast, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you're listening from. That would be greatly appreciated. We hope you'll join us next week as we continue to highlight and discuss some of the most important ongoing legal issues that affect religious liberty and the work of faith-based nonprofit organizations. And just to tease, we will have a special episode coming out later this week with hopefully with an attorney from the Alliance Defending Freedom to discuss a couple of big cases currently making their way up. So I'll leave you with that. We'll talk to you next week. Thank you all for joining us, and God bless you.